Okay, good morning, everybody. Today we are doing notes on reproduction. This is actually from yesterday. This is actually from Wednesday, but if you were gone and did not get this, you should do this. Today's assignment will be a reading assignment. You'll see that online as well. So make sure you get these notes down. They're pretty short, and then start working on that reading assignment on evolution. So we talked about reproduction in class yesterday. Reproduction is simply when you are making more of your species, when you're having children, when plants are dropping seeds and those seeds are growing into new plants, when cells or bacteria are dividing and making new cells. Those are all forms of reproduction. Reproduction, there's two forms of reproduction. The first type is what's called sexual reproduction, and the second type is what's called asexual reproduction. And we're going to discuss the difference between these two, and we'll keep it pretty tame. We'll talk about the cells involved, so we will talk about sperm cells and egg cells, as well as sexual and asexual reproduction. But that's as bad as it's going to get, I promise. So let's go ahead and go through these notes. Now, these notes, I've also posted the slides besides this video, so you can go and take them there and get them in your notebook, or you can pause the video as we go here and get them written down. Either way is fine. So the first type of reproduction is sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is when two parents are required. And again, you can pause this slide and write it, or just get it off the slides that I posted with this video. So if there are two parents and each parent is sharing some DNA to the child, that is what qualifies it as sexual reproduction. Because there are two sources of DNA, because the DNA comes from mom and from dad, or from two organisms, then the child, as we can see the two children here, the child doesn't end up looking exactly like either one. Will this boy end up looking exactly like dad? No. Will the little girl end up looking exactly like mom? It's impossible. She doesn't have 100% of mom's DNA. She only has half of mom's DNA. The other half came from dad. So she's going to be, a mixture of their traits. She'll have some traits that neither mom or dad have because they were recessive and they happen to show up now in the child. So she's going to have her own look, her own DNA. So this is sexual reproduction. Two parents involved, each one gives half of the DNA, and the child gets a mixture. So they aren't a little clone. They don't look exactly like either one. Okay, feel free once again to pause this if you need to. Please write down these examples. So sexual reproduction is used both by animals and humans and by plants. These are the two categories of organisms that would use sexual reproduction. And yes, plants use this as well. I don't know if you know this, but there are actual female and male plants. So with humans or animals, whether it's kittens, puppies, horses, people, to use sexual reproduction, there's two reproductive cells. One is called the sperm cell. That's what the males have. And the females have a reproductive cell called an egg cell. Now, when you look at your cells, we know that in your body, if this is your cell, trying to find a pen that works here. If this is your cell, in your cell you have a nucleus in there, right? The nucleus is where the DNA is found. See if I can make this bigger here. Okay, so in the nucleus is the DNA, right? And that DNA is bound up in these little bundles, as we know. They look like X's, called chromosomes. Now, do you remember how many chromosomes humans have in their cells? We talked about it briefly, but humans have 46 chromosomes in each of their cells. Every single cell has 46 chromosomes. You could take a brain cell, it's going to have those 46 chromosomes. You could take a skin cell, it's going to have 46 chromosomes. And they're the same 46 chromosomes. They're copies of each other. They look exactly the same. Because every time a cell divides, it copies all the DNA. So every cell in your body has a copy of those 46 chromosomes. The exception to that, the cells that don't have 46, are those reproductive cells, which we said again, for males is the sperm cell. We'll draw it like this. And for females is the egg cell. Those cells do not have 46 chromosomes in them. They have half the number. They only have 23. Now, why would that be? Why would there only be 23 chromosomes in the reproductive cells? Well, when the sperm and the egg join, we say the sperm cell fertilizes the egg. It makes a new cell with how many chromosomes? 23 plus 23 is 46. The number needed to make a person. And so when you're a baby, the sperm cell and the egg cell join. And again, this is true of kittens or horses or anything else, except for that the number to start would be different, but it's always half that number for the reproductive cells. You start as this one cell. Half those chromosomes from mom, half of them from dad. And then what does that cell do? Well, it splits into two cells. It makes copies of those 46 chromosomes in it. And then those cells split into 4, and they have copies of those 46 chromosomes. They get copies of them. Then it's 8, 16, 32, 64, until it makes the trillions of cells that make you. So that is sexual reproduction. Reproductive cells always have half the number. Well, it's no different for plants. Because plants also have reproductive cells. But instead of, well, here we'll draw a cell here for a plant. Let's say this is our plant cell. And we'll just say, I don't know, I'm going to make up a number. Let's say it has 10 chromosomes. Plants don't have as many, 10 chromosomes. Instead of sperm and egg cells, they have these little yellow things called pollen. Pollen is essentially the same thing as sperm cells. And the female plant will have a seed, which is essentially the same thing as an egg cell. Okay, if these are the reproductive cells and there's 10 in a normal plant cell, how many would be in the pollen? Half that number. So each piece of pollen would have 5 chromosomes. And how many would be in the seed? Also 5. So that when a bee, like we see here, flies to this flower and picks up some pollen, which is, by the way, on accident. The bee doesn't care about pollen. He's there for the nectar, for the sweet stuff, which the flower uses to attract the bee. He says, hey, come here, bee. Drink this nectar. Then the bee accidentally picks up the pollen, which is what the plant really wants. Then he flies to the next flower and drops it on the seed, right? So when the pollen and the seed are joined, you get a fertilized seed with how many chromosomes? 5 and 5. It's the 10 needed to grow that plant. If this seed that never received pollen hits the dirt, will it grow into a plant? It can't. It never was fertilized. It never received pollen. It doesn't have all the DNA it needs. So once it receives the pollen, it can grow. So those are examples of sexual reproduction. Now, the other form of reproduction is asexual reproduction. Again, pause if you need to and write this down or get it from your slides. But asexual reproduction is different. There's only one parent. Usually we're talking about a cell dividing, like a bacteria splitting into 2 bacteria. And when it does that, it copies all the DNA. So the offspring, right, you have one that splits into 2. Those 2 offspring have the exact same DNA as the original cell did, the original bacteria. We're not talking about cats here. Cats don't split in half and become 2 kittens. That'd be weird. It doesn't work that way. But a cell does. So mitosis, cell division, is an example of asexual reproduction. One parent that usually splits into 2 things, and the offspring then have the exact same DNA as the parent did. So finally, last slide. Again, pause here if you need to and write down these examples, and I'll talk about them. So, like we said, the main example is cell division. That's almost always. When we're talking asexual reproduction, we're almost always talking about cell division. But there are a few other examples. Like, let's talk about this one down here at the bottom. Mushrooms, fungi are not the same thing as plants. I think people often get them confused. They think, oh yeah, mushrooms, those are just like plants. They're not. They're their own category. There's animals, plants, and fungi. Those are three different things. Fungi do not have seeds and pollen like a plant does. Okay, plants have seeds and pollen that have to fertilize. 5 chromosomes to make a seed with 10. But a fungus, like a mushroom or a mold or a mildew or whatever, they have these little things called spores. That's all they have. There aren't seeds and pollen. So if a fungus cell has 10 chromosomes in a normal cell, how many chromosomes are in the spore? 10. It has all the DNA it needs to make a new mushroom. So it doesn't have to receive pollen or anything. The mushroom grows its own spores. Those spores have the same DNA as the parent, so when they drop, they grow a mushroom, and that mushroom has the exact same DNA as the mushroom it came from. Spores have everything they need to grow. It's different than seeds and pollen. Asexual reproduction. One parent, and the offspring has the same DNA as the parent. Another example, plant clippings that will regrow if they're planted. You may have seen that there are some plants, maybe you dealt with something like this, where the plant grows like this, and if you take a piece of it, you take off just a little piece, and you put it in a different pot and you plant it in the dirt, that piece of the plant will grow its own roots and grow into a whole new plant. Well, where did this plant come from? You just ripped off a piece and put it there, and it grew a new one. Now, most plants cannot do this. This is not a normal thing. Some plants can. Most have to do that sexual reproduction, seeds and pollen. There are a few that can do this, but this is an exception. How would the DNA of these two compare? Well, they'd have the exact same DNA. Came from the same plant. And then the last example, you can see this tree right here. Most trees can't do this, but again, some trees are what we call self-pollinating. So you have your tree, and usually you have one tree that has pollen and maybe another tree that will have seed pods on it, right? And the pollen has to cross here, and then those can grow into a new tree. That's how it normally works, sexual reproduction. But there are some trees which can have pollen on one part of the tree and seeds on the same tree, male and female. In which case, if that pollen gets up here on that seed, it fertilizes its own seed. And then that seed will drop, grow into a new tree. How would those DNA of those two trees compare? Well, how many parents were there? Just one. Fertilize its own seeds. So this will have the same DNA as this. Okay? Asexual reproduction. Again, that's an exception though. Almost always with asexual reproduction, we're talking cell division and fungi dropping spores. The others are rare cases. And there are some other rare cases, but that's all we'll go into. All right. Make sure you have these notes taken, and then look at your reading assignment for today, and I will see you guys later.